Hi, everybody. My name is Nick Marshall, and I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at the George Eastman Museum. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Deconstructing Iconic Images, featuring visual artist, photographer, and educator Joshua Rashaad McFadden, in conversation with Lisa Hostetler, curator in charge of the Department of Photography at George Eastman Museum. McFadden's work can be seen in the Eastman Museum's upcoming exhibition, Gathering Clouds, Photographs from the 19th Century and Today, which features a selection of works from McFadden as well as a number of other contemporary artists. The exhibition opens Sunday, July 19th, when the museum reopens to the public. We will be taking preventative measures to keep our guests, staff, and students safe, so we do ask that you please review our new protocols for visiting the museum. Those safety measures can be accessed on our website, where you'll also be able to purchase contactless tickets if you'd like. If you have questions throughout today's talk, please submit them through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. There is a chat function that is open, and I see some people are using that already to say hello. So that's great. We can use that to say hi and talk to each other, but we will not be monitoring the chat function for questions. We'll only be monitoring the Q&A. So at the end of the presentation, I'll go through some of the questions with Joshua, Rashad, and Lisa. But if there's a large volume of questions coming in, we may not be able to get to them all. So I'll apologize in advance if we don't get to your question, but we'll do our best. We will be recording today's webinar and putting it on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. So if you'd like to go back and watch again, share with others, you'll be able to access it along with our other webinars and video content through YouTube. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Hostetler.
Thank you, Nick. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm going to introduce Joshua Rashaad McFadden. But before I do that, just want to tell you a little bit about the plan for how today's conversation will go. So after I introduce Joshua Rashad, he'll take us through a little bit of his work, his recent work, which he's done covering the protests that have been happening this summer, and showing some of the work that has influenced his approach. And then we'll be having a conversation about his work and his practice, and about how museums can work with artists to preserve the work the timely work that they're doing as it's happening. So Joshua Rashaad McFadden is an artist and editorial photographer whose work has appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, U.S. News and World Reports, and A&E television networks. His work has been shown in multiple solo and group exhibitions. And in addition to its appearing in Heather Shannon's exhibition, Gathering Clouds at the Eastman Museum, the Eastman Museum will be presenting a solo exhibition of his work in our project gallery in 2022? 2021? 2021. Thank you. So we're very excited to have him join us to talk about some of the images that sort of reside in our collective consciousness and how they have shaped the way he has been covering the events of this summer and spring. So I'll turn it over to you, Joshua Rashad.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I think this would be a great conversation about images and how they kind of move or create action, I guess, spark action, but while also kind of documenting actions. Anywho, so yeah, oh, and it's my birthday today.
Happy birthday!
Yeah. I forget, but anyway, yeah, it's my birthday today, so I'm glad to kind of take a break and share it with you all. So I guess we'll start here. with an image I made in 2016 in Atlanta, Georgia, called AW. And you can't really tell on the screen here, but it's a very massive portrait photograph that I made of someone, a young black man in Atlanta. And this project's called Selfhood, and it talks about or looks at the black man presenting himself in a way that he wants to be presented, free of negative perception, free of um, harm, free of violence. He's able to just be. And this is actually in an exhibit now at the Eastman Museum about clouds. And so you see in the background this kind of gray background that I made with charcoal on this artist paper. And it's basically about this man's kind of emerging from the clouds, kind of clouds can kind of be something that kind of blurs vision. When people say, yeah, it's kind of cloudy, you can't really think straight, but he's kind of coming out of that. And so that's the idea behind that and why that's included in that exhibit. And we'll talk about a little bit why or how my work kind of treads this line between fine art, documentary, and then journalism, and what that means for me, what that means for, I guess, the bigger picture of, photography as art, which has been a big argument over the many, many, many years that photography has existed. And then we're also going to talk about iconic imagery. Okay. So I start here with an image by Charles Moore of Martin Luther King, who was being arrested during a sit-in protest. And of course, we all know about Martin Luther King and the movement, the civil rights movement, and what he was doing in the South, particularly Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. But we also have to know that Martin Luther King also knew about the power of photographs and what they could do. And so he purposefully worked with photographers to expose racism in the South. And it was the imagery that caught the attention of the world and why things were able to move forward in the way that they did. As far as achieving things like voters' rights for African Americans and many other civil rights. We'll see it more throughout this presentation. Mm-hmm. But I want everybody to kind of keep that in their mind as we go through this presentation, the role that imagery plays in like these big uprisings.
Just to piggyback on that, Joshua, Rashad, I think that's an important point, is that the civil rights movement was happening at a moment where it was documented in real time and broadcast in real time to sort of galvanize people to understand and appreciate what was happening. Whereas, geographic disjointedness can be an impediment to understanding how things are in other places. And I think that we're also seeing that happen somewhat today with, and social media sort of documents it even more in real time.
Yes.
And I know that your Instagram feed and various social media has really helped us to understand that aspect as well. So.
Definitely. Yeah, I'm actually in Louisville, Kentucky right now, documenting the unrest due to Breonna Taylor's murder. And so I'm here in a car because that's usually how this goes, kind of traveling to different sites. And so I kind of pulled over to have this talk with you all. So this next image is an image I made. oh, sorry. This is an image I made in Atlanta, Georgia, soon after Rashad Brooks was killed at a Wendy's in Atlanta after he was sleeping in his car or fell asleep in his car. And protesters began to come to that area. They were really already in the area protesting because of the murder of George Floyd. And so, which happened maybe 3 or 4 weeks or 5 weeks prior to. And so now protests were even more amped up as Rashad was killed very, very, very soon after. And so here we see a protester in a standoff with a police officer. Then going back to imagery from the civil rights movement, we see an image from Charles Moore where demonstrators were sprayed by water hoses, water that, you know, can bring a force of about 100 pounds per square inch. And this also happening in Birmingham, Alabama. So seeing images like these and seeing how, you know, violence was, you know, the main, how violence was always the kind of the main idea behind, you know, police force. Even when people were peacefully protesting, especially in Martin Luther King's demonstrations, it shows you that even with peaceful protesting, they were met with violence. And I think that's an important thing for people to remember when we kind of talk about violence, or we talk about protest, or we talk about protests that turn into what someone might call a riot, that in any way that people demonstrate, they're always met with violence. And so here we have an image, another image from another night of protest in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, a standoff with protesters and police officers. And I found this interesting because a lot of the police officers in Atlanta are Black. And so you started to see that dynamic happen to where people are asking, well, how could you do this to Black people? How could you be a Black police officer? And it reminds me of a painting by Basquiat. I believe it's The Irony of a Negro Policeman. I believe that's the name. And so it always reminds me of this conversation that has happened for a very long time about Black police officers and this idea of policing the Black community, or the idea that Black police officers join the force to have this, to create change. But then we have to ask, well, what change is truly being created if, you know, certain things aren't being reported when they're very aware of what happens at their place of work. Here we have an image from Ernest Withers in Memphis, Tennessee, the sanitation workers strike. One of the last demonstrations that was held right before Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. And so here we see Black men with signs that say, "I am a man," you know, again, stating that they have this humanity that people are ignoring, but also fighting for, you know, equal working rights, things that, again, people are still fighting for today. So I think it's important to, again, remember that, first of all, this wasn't that long ago that the sanitation worker strike happened, and also that some of these men are still alive. I actually did a project for Smithsonian magazine, photographing the sanitation workers. I wish I put it in this presentation. I'm wondering if I could pull it up. Photographing the surviving strikers at that time, and some were 80 years old, and some still had to work, which was interesting, right? You know, you shouldn't be 80 still working or having to work, right? You should be retired. And so it just speaks towards rights that these men were fighting for that may not have been actually achieved. Here we have an image of Jay Brown, Black police officer in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, we start to see the idea of the Black police officer. I think you can kind of see a certain look on his face, almost a stare into distance, but also looking at what's surrounding him. You know, he's surrounded by fellow Black Americans protesting him, right? And so you just have to think about what's going through his mind. You know, is it why did I become a police officer? Is he starting to question, you know, his work, or not? You know. And then we go to an image by Gordon Parks, the American Gothic, iconic image of a woman, working woman, standing in front of an American flag, and we see so much controversy surrounding the American flag. When people also, you know, think that you know, protest when people protest in America, they're also protesting the American flag or don't have patriotism. But when truly the act of being able to protest is very American, right? It's very democracy, voicing your opinion. So, you know, that's what that kind of conversation brings up for me is this American flag and seeing Black people embrace it or being photographed with it or around it. And so it reminded me of this image that I made in Atlanta at Rashad Brooks's funeral, outside of the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. The Ebenezer Baptist Church is where Martin Luther King's grandfather preached. Don't mark my words on it. I believe it was father and grandfather. So yes, outside of that church, a very historic landmark. Also the street of his childhood home. Also location of the King Center in Atlanta, and it's the historic Auburn district of Atlanta. So just a place kind of loaded with history. But then you have a woman who marched in marches in the 60s for rights and felt the need to come out to Rashad Brooks's funeral during a pandemic. You know, and she said that she felt like she should come and support because the young people are out fighting for rights that she thought she fought for and had been achieved. And so she said it's her job, it's her duty to be there. And so I made her a photograph because she was holding a flag, she was wearing a flag, you know, red, white, and blue. And it showed me that she still does believe in the future of this country, which was interesting to me, very interesting to me. Hearing, you know, interviewing her and hearing about the things that she's been through, you know, as a Black woman in this country, as a woman with children, Black children in this country, to see these things still happen. It was very interesting to me to see that she believes in the future of the country, and more so the future of the country for the youth. So she felt she needed to show up for the youth. Moving on to an image that I made in Minneapolis. This was a little bit after the funeral of George Floyd, of almost a public arts piece that was made near the site where George Floyd was killed in a local park down the street from the Cup Foods site that you probably heard about. The Cup Foods store is where George Floyd was when the owner of the store or worker at the store, worker or owner, called the police on George Floyd. And so this was made down the street. It is fascinating to me to see the public art that goes up around these cities when trauma happens, these traumatic moments and tragedies happen, and the memorials that grow and grow and grow. Sculptures were made, murals were made, these kind of happenings, this graveyard was made. And so this was the moment I captured when I first heard about the public arts piece. I was actually doing an interview for The Atlantic. I believe her name is Miski. Miski told me about this site. And so she said, well, let's do the interview by the site. So after our interview, after our interview, I made this image. I don't want to assume, I believe it was a couple who was standing there. They didn't know I was behind them, and I grabbed this image. I made this image of them, and you see, say their names, which actually is originally and meant to say, the original phrase is say her name, and I want to say that because say her name was specifically made for Black women who have gone ignored after they've been killed by police officers. And so say her name was started to as a chant and as a call to action to remember women such as Sandra Bland and such as Breonna Taylor. And so, the say their names has been a little bit controversial. And I know this image has kind of traveled and been published widely at this point. But I wanted to make sure that people knew that it's say her name. It's say her name, and we must remember the Black women, the Black trans women that have been killed and murdered and then gone forgotten. I think that's very important to say. Another image. This image was actually taken, I made this image the day I arrived to Minneapolis. I actually decided to go. I just decided to go. I won't say randomly, but I had the feeling that I needed to go. I was in Rochester, and I just drove overnight. And when I arrived, it was after the first night of the fires that happened. And I saw people boarding up their windows, business owners boarding up their windows, but also like posting up signs that say Black Lives Matter. So that was an interesting thing to see. Whether they were putting that sign up there just to protect their business or in support, I don't know. But it was interesting to see that plastered across the city on these different businesses, but also like businesses that, put on their window, this is a Black owned business, such and such. So soon after I saw that, I began to chat with people that were standing outside. You can see people just kind of trying to grasp what was going on around them, but also just feeling so sad. It was such a sad moment. Just, you can see it on people's faces because the murder of George Floyd was still so fresh. And I started to ask people what's going on and where are people? And they pointed me in the direction right down the street. I guess a protest just passed, and I went down the street, and the street was filling up with people. The sun was going down, and that's when this image was made. And they're actually, like, right in front of them is actually like police officers blocking off a parking lot where some cars were on fire and a dumpster and a building. So I believe, and so they're facing the police. And now we go back. We'll take it back to an image made by Eli Reed at the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. in 1995. So I was 5 years old then. Just to kind of give a little of the timeline here, So again, to see this happening maybe a few years after the Rodney King, right, beating by police, right? So if we recognize this work on a timeline of happenings, we have to really say, like, have these things ever kind of stopped? I would say no, right? And so we really have to be conscious of where we exist on this timeline of history, the history of police brutality, or the history of systemic oppression. Well, I guess the umbrella of systemic oppression and racism, and then how these other things fall under it, and what America is trying or doing to remedy these issues. And so here we have an image of Black men at the Million Man March, and we begin to see, this moment, right? So I guess we can start to talk about the iconic moment. What makes a photograph iconic,
Yeah,
right? So, yeah.
I was gonna say, the next few images have some really powerful symbols and kind of a persistence of gesture in them that seem to communicate directly and emotionally. And this gesture of the raised fist, and even the gesture of both arms up, has a long history in documentary imagery in general, but in particular to this movement that's happening. And as we look over the next few images, you can see how it persists sort of in history and in your work as well. So maybe we can go through a couple of those, and then I wanted to just go back to a point or two from earlier into some juxtaposition. So I think this is so important to these works that
yeah, just let me know, like, which ones you want to go back to, and
sure.
I'll gladly do that. So yeah, here we see the Black Power fist, and right underneath, the America. So we start to see text and language come in this image. We see a direct gaze from I don't know if you all can see my cursor. Yes, we see a direct gaze into the camera here. So he's engaging with the photographer, and I believe that that's very important to see, like, who's engaging and who's not, or who's disengaging, and how those moments happen within one photograph. And there's certainly moments that happened for me that way, especially during the protest. And then also, like, there's this big question, which I won't go into deeply. There's this big question about photographing protests and protesters, and covering up, the need to cover up their face because people don't want to be identified. I'm not going to give an answer on that, but there's a big conversation happening about that right now. But I know right here, I know this man wanted to be photographed, and that's his fist, right? To make a point. And I think we learn from images like this. And these types of images are ingrained into history, not only history, but into our minds, so that we may remember what we've gone through, so that we don't go through it again. And the images really help us do that, or make us do that, right?
They lodge themselves in our emotional constitution, I think, and both personally, but also I think collectively. And it helps us, it sort of speaks directly to feeling an emotion in a way.
Yes. So, actually, there's another gaze here, right here, right?
Yeah.
And so, and then he's engaged with, I'm thinking, whoever was speaking at the time. And I actually photographed a Million Man March, I think 2013 or 14. None of those images are here, but I did do that. And so here we have an image I made in Atlanta, at the Wendy's site where Rashad Brooks was killed. In the back, you'll see a painting being painted, a portrait of Rashad Brooks by a local artist. And in the forefront, you see a young man holding up the fist, but in his fist, he has a rose and he's holding a sign. So we start to see repetition here, right? That we were talking about. That Black Power fist that you'll see in many, 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 many images, not only my images, but pretty much whoever's documenting protests, you'll see that Black Power fist. repeated over and over and over again. Here we go again, right? So taking it back to a moment at the Olympics. Very iconic moment where the U.S. athletes, Tommy Smith and John Carlos, stared downwards during the ceremony and held their fist up as an act of protest. Okay. And they were reprimanded for doing this. Yes.
I was just going to point out that I read an article recently about the Australian athlete and how the three of them had talked beforehand, and they asked him, you know, they worked out what they were going to do beforehand, and so he was talking about his experience there and at the time, and it was. He had a really interesting take on it, and one that one might not expect. But I think that was such a pivotal moment. I mean, we've just looked at several images that are 1968. I mean, that year seems to be one where so many of these key images were made. And just to go back a little bit, the fist with the rose, it's, and also your picture of the police officer and the protester confronting each other. It calls to my mind the very last picture in this presentation with the Mark Rabu of the woman with the flower in the policeman's gun.
Yes.
And I think it has to do with the sort of power, the powerful, and the less power and the powerless, and the structure of that image meeting this sort of big wall of power with a more delicate sort of peaceful gesture. And so I like the combination in your picture of the protester holding the rose up, where it's both the power and the fragility in the same image. That kind of, I think, really brings the point home, makes it very salient. But I was just sort of musing on that, on the circulation of those sort of motifs that we see in protest and how they work with each other to communicate.
Yes. It's so interesting to see how things repeat in history, and especially when it's captured in a photograph. So, where was I here?
So you were out at the '68 Olympics. Yeah.
Yes. So, exactly. So seeing that repetition, and the fact that they planned this, it was a plan. Excuse me. It was a planned protest. My water. It's not by, happenstance that these things are happening. It was it was a way that they could show and express how they felt.
And on a global stage, which we're seeing today's movement also is assuming global proportions.
And it just reminds me of now it reminds me of sheesh. Forgive
It'll come back.
I'm tired. It just reminds me of the conversations. Hold on.
Joshua Rashad's been traveling between like so many cities constantly in a pandemic, so we can cut him some slack here.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it's like it's Yeah, it's been difficult. You know, pretty much no sleep. You know, the protesters don't sleep, I think, and the people that cover these protests don't sleep. To get the visuals out to the world about what's going on. You know, a lot of and we still don't get it all. And we still don't get it all. So yes, please forgive me. And if you feel like I've forgotten something, you know, just ask me in the question and answer section. So yeah, I was saying, yeah, with the Black Fist and the moments of protest, it reminds me of the NFL and Colin Kaepernick
Oh yes, of course.
and the kneeling when in sports, and also Muhammad Ali, right?
Yep.
And these active, well, these athletes and activists, right? Bringing the activism into their profession, because there's these different intersections that happen, you know, within ourselves and how we identify, right? So people, you know, um, even with what I do in covering protests, I'm still a Black man, right? So just seeing how that all kind of connects, and with Kaepernick and with Muhammad Ali, and how they were reprimanded for for taking a stand for what they believe in.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because we always all bring our whole selves to what we do as a profession. I mean, it's your profession wants you for those features that make you who you are,
Right.
and that so you can't go and do your job, and they wouldn't want you to do your job with only part of who you are. But
Right, because it wouldn't work.
sometimes messing or mixing all of these things together can get complicated when it gets into a larger arena, and when I think our culture really likes to divide the sort of, here's the professional realm, and here's the personal realm, and but there are things that don't can't stay within those lines, or don't easily stay within those lines, and
Right, because especially when, again, if we bring back, you know, the idea of systemic oppression, so
yep.
you know, why is that allowed to come into the, you know, the
Mhm.
professional world, right?
Exactly.
And impact a certain group of people, but then to say, you know, they can't say anything about it. And that's the whole idea about, you know, Kaepernick kneeling about police brutality, but then having a system that reprimanded him for having a say about something that impacts his daily life.
Hmm.
It's something that's still going on right now. And so, moving on to an image I made in Minneapolis of a man who was out after the curfew that was placed, 8 o'clock curfew that was placed after the 2 nights of fires that happened. And he, you know, the interesting thing was, like, some people still had to work after this, um, you know, after those incidents. And some people had to work nights. And so, but everybody that was out walking or driving, I've seen police officers shoot rubber bullets at them. So they actually did shoot a rubber bullet at this man after they shined a light on him. And so, for me, this image represents, you know, again, you know, this kind of spotlight um, that's on, you know, Black people in general. Um, you know, conceptually speaking, you know, or like a target, or you can look at it as, you know, you have to perform in a certain way to get by. There's so many levels of meaning within this photograph for me. But
Hmm.
also, he's, you know, literally being targeted by police in this photograph. And in this photograph is a woman in Atlanta, Georgia, who staged a die-in protest by herself um, in front of a police line, a barricade. They created a police line and protecting the Zone 3 police precinct in Atlanta, Georgia. And this was very late. This was very late at night. It's either 1 or 2 in the morning. And she laid there. And I felt like to get this shot, I needed to be down there with her. And so that's how that shot was made. Mhm. But also seeing again, the murals that pop up around the city or at the memorial sites, the murals and the flowers. And so this was in Minneapolis, on the building where Cup Foods is. And this particular mural was very popular. It was kind of seen across the world. T-shirts were even made of it, and I believe they projected it at George Floyd's funeral on a big screen. And so to see like this artwork in a way of healing for people has been inspiring for me. And portraits of protesters. This young man was standing high up over a barricade built by protesters to protect the memorial site and the site where George Floyd was killed. So there was almost 2 barricades built and very high up, like fences, so that police officers could not get in or agitators could not get in. They wanted to keep this site peaceful. They wanted it to be a place where people could go and remember George Floyd. These sites, people begin to like bring their grills and feed people because the protesters are out there basically 24/7, and they bring food, they bring they give away things to people, personal items. They sometimes play music. People bring flowers, and so for me it was nice to see like these spaces become a place that people can go to get healing.
Yeah.
And then this image from Atlanta, Georgia on Juneteenth, which we heard like an explosion of awareness about Juneteenth this year, right?
Yeah.
Which is, Juneteenth has been going on for a very, very long time. And so this is from a protest that happened on Juneteenth in Atlanta. And there had to be over 10,000 people. It was so many people marching across the city. And so that's what this image represents.
So maybe we can pause here because I'd like to address a little bit of when you're covering these protests, and just having mentioned like bringing your whole self to it. You're covering these protests. You're also making artwork that we're seeing, that we'll see in the exhibitions. How do those two things integrate in your practice? And maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then we'll need to open it up for questions so that we can include the audience in this. But I would love to hear you sort of talk about how do you navigate that scenario.
Well, it's been a wild, long, crazy story. But maybe not. Maybe it's been very simple. I think that, I know that I've always been an artist since I was little. Painting, drawing, anything, arts and crafts, any kind of creative making, I was interested in it. And it was my mother who introduced me to that. But she also introduced me to photography. But knowing now that my family has a very long lineage in photography that I'm still like learning about now.
Yeah.
But she got me a camera at age 7, and then like new ones throughout growing up. But at that point, at that time, I saw image making, family pictures, as just family pictures. I didn't see those as art, but now I do. I think it's something very special about our family archive, our personal archives that can tell a specific part of history that's not necessarily told all the time, especially in the Black community. And when we think about pictures and we think about photographs, they speak towards this importance. We make an image of something because we think it's important to make that image. We get that feeling like, okay, I'm gonna make it. I'm gonna, what was the Kodak moment? I'm going to solidify this in our personal history. We're gonna publish it in our own, what do you call it, family album.
Yeah.
And it's going to be there forever, and we're going to pass it on. And so we see importance when we think about photographs. We think about importance, and so I wanted to bring that into my my art practice. I see photographers as artists. Some people don't, but I do. I call myself an artist. I see photographs as art, and I will, and that's a hill I'm willing to stay on forever. So when I went to undergrad, I was a fine art major. But senior year, I decided to do my junior year, senior year, I took a black and white photography class. Then I loved photography even more. Then my senior year, I decided to do my senior project solely with photography. And so from there, I saw that people reacted to photographs differently than a painting. They felt it, they could feel it, and I think that's what makes an iconic photograph. Like we said earlier,
Right.
you feel it, you can feel that photograph, but also you can identify it because it's not associated with fantasy.
Right.
It can be now. It can
right.
be now. There's genres of photography that brings things into fantasy, into dreams, into things that may not exist physically, and photos can be manipulated, so on and so forth, digitally. But they were manipulated back then too. We just didn't,
Right.
we may not know.
Yep.
But so I think, but the overall assumption is that photographs represent reality. And so when people see a photograph, they can identify with who's in it, and they can identify with the situation that's happened. We often see images that depict traumatic situations. We go back to imagery of 9/11. We go back to imagery of slavery, and we go back to imagery of the lynchings, the many lynchings that's happened. And those are moments that have happened, and those were people. And it would be inhumane to not acknowledge those lives that were lost, right? And I think that's what photography brings to the table. And so I liked how people reacted to my imagery. And so I said, okay, I'll go to grad school and kind of hone this skill a little bit more. And that's when I moved to Atlanta and was there for about 7 to 8 years, doing that and working in the industry after graduating, but developing these conceptual ways of making photographs and presenting photographs.
So it was really the humanism of photography as an enterprise that you approach the medium with, and whether it's meant for your artwork or it's meant for a editorial audience, you're approaching it the same way. It's just applied to different subjects. Whether it's one you came up with or one you found when you came to a site.
Exactly. And so I have this pulled up quickly to where we can go, and these images are from After Selma, a project that I started in 2015, and we can quickly start to kind of scroll through and see the connections between these bodies of work, and I think that'll explain your idea a little bit more. And so this is a project that I did in Selma, Alabama, about the march from Selma to Montgomery, but these were made in 2015. The anniversary of that march, the 50th anniversary of that march, or commemoration rather, of that march. And but it was also the same year that the uprisings happened in Ferguson.
Mhm.
And so we start to see, like, again, repetition. And I specifically made this project, made these photographs in black and white because I wanted to speak towards that idea of history even more. I wanted the images to remind people of the 60s, even though we see like smartphones and we see, you know, Black Lives Matter, right? So we
Right.
clearly know that this is 2015. We see images of Black men being arrested that were protesting. Images from other countries in Martinique where they uh, go against this kind of idea of traditional masculinity, that idea of protest. Then I wanted to show these images that I made in 2018, 19, 17, when the Frederick Douglass statue was taken down,
Right.
not this year, but 2 years
Mhm.
ago. And
Mhm.
so I went to the site where it happened. There is a big apartment complex behind these two men here now. So it doesn't even look like this anymore. But we have to know that these things have happened before, and now it's repeating even quicker. And so when we know that Frederick Douglass did the speech about the 4th of July on the 5th, about what is the 4th of July to the Negro or the enslaved person. That same week, the statue in Rochester was taken down again.
Right.
And so sadly, I don't have these images anymore. I only have them in this presentation because, again, that digital image has been lost. A hard drive of mine failed. And we had a conversation about that a little bit. And so those
Mhm.
images were on that hard drive. So this is all I have. I should take a screenshot of it now.
Yeah. Put that in the
But
cloud right
so
away.
yeah, so looking at Frederick Douglass and looking at how Frederick Douglass was a photo historian actually, and used photographs to depict African Americans in a way that he thought they should be, and that was not something that Black Americans could really do in his time. And so he was a revolutionary, not only in all of the other things that he did, but even in photography, becoming one of the the most photographed men, ever.
Yeah.
And seeing how, this man brought his image of Frederick Douglass to the site in remembrance, and brought this image and as an act of protest. Looking at family images and um, and the personal archive, bringing that into this idea of the family archive as fine art. But then scrolling down and going to a project. Oh, going down to the project I did with I Am a Man. We saw the image of the sanitation strikers in Memphis, Tennessee earlier in the presentation. Well, this man was there. This man was there. And I had the opportunity to photograph him for Smithsonian magazine and do a story about I Am a Man and the sanitation strikers today. And so again, seeing repetition in history. And then taking the idea of I am a man and applying it to the generation now, our generations, and how we can see that ideas about malehood or gender are starting to open up and be dismantled. And so talking about gender and how people can identify however they want to. Um, and so I started another project that's now called Evidence, that looked into the portrait and also the narrative as a portrait. And I wanted to magnify the narrative as a very important piece, the personal narrative, as a part of the personal archive, and things that should be saved and should be published. And so they responded to the prompt, I am a man, and some people went totally against that idea. Some people talked about growing up and not necessarily being able to identify that way, right? Would they be able to be included in that protest back in the 60s if that's not how they identified? And so, and thinking about just those conflicts that happen with traditional uh, gender identity. And so they also talked about ideas of freedom. And so what is this new ideas of freedom, and what are we seeking now in 2020? And then that brings us back to Frederick Douglass and the North Star, because I published these stories in a newspaper based upon the idea that there are these Black newspapers. And so we see the Black man on the corner selling a newspaper, that you may have seen that before. I'm talking about that idea that we need to disperse this information, because at that time, our stories were not being published and they were not being told accurately. And so Frederick Douglass took it upon himself, and many other people, to start newspapers and to tell the story and to report these issues. And it's a newspaper that was started in Rochester, New York. And so why not create a newspaper called Evidence, evidence of these young men and their being and their stories in Rochester, New York. And so these are the people that I collaborated with on that project, because I collaborated with writers, K. Anthony Jones, Jere Holder, Thomas Allen Harris, and Ronald Lusant, who designed the layout for the newspaper. And so a massive project that I did with Visual Studies Workshop in Rochester, New York. And it was interesting because soon after this project was exhibited, COVID-19 happened,
Right.
or was already happening, but anyways, we won't go into that. So COVID-19, we had to shut down. And so, but I had this paper published, and I just got the idea. I said, well, I'm going to send it out. I'm going to send out 50 copies, and so that people can interact with the work. And I did. And people saw the work and they interacted with the work, but the work started to arrive just when George Floyd was murdered. And so that, again, this was pretty heart-wrenching for me, because you start to say, well, how is this work working? Is it working? Are people getting the message? Is it getting out there? When will people see the humanity in African Americans? When will justice truly prevail, and
Right.
people have true freedom, and people begin to really acknowledge what true freedom is?
Right, and being able to share. You kind of came back full circle to your work on the protests. So we're reflecting on this whole history and the evidence work. And right as that was coming out, you were sort of called out to tell a different story that's happening right now. And photography was your means of doing both of those things. And I think that is helping to open up the dialogue that you were talking about, and allow for more freedom and more telling, allowing people to tell their own stories, and Black Americans to tell their own stories. And I think that's important, that we're all seeing this happen at this moment. I know that I hate to cut the conversation short, but I know we do need to move into some questions. And so I wanted to turn it to Nick for the audience questions.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you both for the great conversation. So the first three questions that came in, I'm going to kind of wrap them into one question with a few questions built into it, because I think that they're kind of getting at the same thing. So do you need to get, so the question came in, do you need to get permission from the person? Example, Jay Brown image. Did you have a conversation about what he might be feeling? How often do you talk to your subjects of your photographs? Do you get their contact info to keep in touch or send them images? And then, so that's kind of one set of questions. And then piggybacking off of that, what's your opinion on selling your work as prints, especially related to this subject matter? So I think that those things are all kind of intertwined in maybe a similar answer.
Well, yeah. So the first questions. Well, Jay Brown, no, I didn't ask him a question. There was a lot going on in the area, even though I was able to kind of capture him almost by himself, which, you know, my focus in my work is portraiture. So I like to capture these portraits within a greater happening or situation, which there were hundreds and hundreds of people all around. And I kind of squoze my way to the front, right, like kind of right there. But I'm a short person, so I can kind of get to where I need to get. Anywho, so no, I did not ask him for information. People were screaming and yelling at him. So now there are moments that I do pull back, and I take a slower kind of approach to photographing a protest, and I will ask people's names and get their story and take a caption such as the woman with the American flag. So I have a whole, that was published on CNN. So you can go and actually read that. So yes, there's yes, there's no's, there's moments to where you have to think about, okay, is it safe to like have a conversation in front of, like on the front line? Right. No, it isn't. But again, these protesters are doing that. So, that's the thing that I keep in my mind, when making these images. Are release forms required? No, it's public space. So no.
So then as part of that question, what's your opinion on selling your work as prints, especially related to this subject matter, which if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that?
I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. I don't know if the question specifically asking me if I sell my work. Is that the question? I don't want to assume, but we can move on.
And what was one of the things that we were talking about before this was just the idea of archiving your work.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And yours, along with all of the others who are documenting these things digitally, and kind of how then does that go on?
Right. So how do we preserve those in a museum collection where we do have, we have been preserving these some of the iconic photographs we were discussing earlier were from our collection and other collections.
Yes.
And so how do we now, and those were, in order to publish a photograph in the press at that time, back then you needed a print. That's how it had to be transmitted, like press prints. Now we're in a digital age where you capture this as it's going on, and it's broadcast and transmitted digitally. So, and I think in tandem with the question that this is what Nick was saying, is like, how can we work together to capture that moment, given that the medium has shifted?
Yeah. Now that is an interesting question. I think that even with the idea of selling the work, I mean that there's multiple ways, even outside of the fine art world or museum world. The image is still the work. The act of making the photograph. If a journalist is working for a newspaper, they're being paid to be there.
Right.
So in a way, there's an exchange here, unless the person is independent and is there, and just making the work, in which I was initially. I went to Minneapolis by myself to continue the work that I've been doing. And so again, like teetering on these lines of the fine art world, documentary, journalism, art, all of those things. I think that, that question is like, or is someone, making a living or making a profit off of protest images or people's likeness? That I think
that's a whole different question.
That's a whole nother,
that's a whole conversation to have. And a separate. I was thinking more like, how can we make sure that museums preserve
Oh yeah.
moments.
But I think yeah,
And within
preserving.
everything, when
Yeah.
everything's digital and we collect objects. But that might be a nerdy internal museum staff question.
Well, I think there's different
A
layers to that
publicly
question.
interesting.
You know, I think there's many layers to that question. I think you can approach, you know, I think you should be approaching artists directly. You know, a lot of this, the fine art culture, you know, things happen through galleries. You know, a lot of people are shut out from the industry.
Right.
And a lot of those people being people of color that have been documented in these communities. You know, I brought up Eli Reed. I think Eli Reed is still the only Magnum photographer. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe he is. And you know, being in an agency is one of those ways that your work gets funneled through these other channels,
Right.
to where they'll be solidified within the historical canon. And you know, a lot of Black photographers' work goes unseen until, you know, they're dead and gone, and it's like, oh my God, we discovered this archive of such and such. It's great. Let's buy it.
Like Ernest Withers is an
Right.
example of that. Yeah.
Exactly. So yeah, that should not happen. And I think social media and the digital world helps us. The digital world helps us kind of remedy that because we can put our work directly out into the world, and it'd be archived in some kind of way, other than just in our, you know, closet or wherever.
Right.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a closet like Prince, or, you know, what, I don't know, you know, in our own hard drives, right? We can actually put these images out there and people can engage, and we don't need to go through a gallery. We don't need to go through a publication. We don't need to go through a museum, or even on a simple level. You don't need to go through an editor, or a university. You can just put the image out. And so I use all of those methods now. I've gone through traditional routes, through school, through portfolio reviews, through editors. I've done it all, and I think that's allowed me to become or get to the level that I'm at now. However, you know, I think I've seen others kind of speed through that, you know, through that process a little bit faster.
Yeah.
So I think we're getting close to wrapping things up, Joshua, Rashad, unless there's anything else you want to get to. There was one question that came in that someone had said, is there any way that we can support you as you cover these events? Example, donating money, sharing on social media, or other methods, and thanking you for doing this coverage.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been terribly sad. Yeah. I think that's the only way I can explain it. To see these families hurting and these communities hurting, and kind of like not knowing what the outcome will be, but almost kind of knowing that justice will not be served just because of what they've seen in the past. So, and to hear the unsureness in their voice, and it's been sad, and I think that what you all can do to help is to fight against systemic oppression and racism, and do your part. That's the number one thing you can do to help me. Because, you know, if everybody did that, I wouldn't be out here photographing moments of, unjust police killings. So yeah, do that. If anything else, you can just reach out to me through my email, which is jrm@joshuarashad.com. I believe you can probably find the link on the website. If not, then maybe it will be there.
I can send it right now in the chat, Joshua.
Yeah.
That's good. JR.
Yeah. JRM@JoshuaRashad, and that's 2 A's.
Yep.
At the end of Rashad. Yeah, you can reach out, email me. There's ways to donate. It is, I'm out here on my own dime. There are ways to, I'm based in Rochester, New York. It's my hometown. I was born and raised. I do have some organizations there that you can reach out to me to get that information. I teach at Rochester Institute of Technology. I teach photography there, and I have students that are also in need. So, I think that there's many ways. I think right now I'm touching pretty much every facet of this industry, and I would like to help in any way that I can, and I would love for you to help me help others any way that you can.
Well, thank you for all of the incredible work that you're doing. Thank you for taking the time out of your obviously busy day as you're
yes, on your birthday.
On your
birthday.
As you're going from place to place. Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm sorry there were a few questions that we didn't have time to get to, but thank you all for hanging with us, and we will be putting this up on YouTube, so please feel free to rewatch, share. That's another way that we can help. I think is by sharing conversations like this that we're having now, and that are happening across the country, to continue to share that content. So thank you all so much, and I hope you all have a nice relaxing as you can weekend. And happy birthday, Joshua Rashad.
Thank you so much.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.